series of webinars. We are, in this case, discussing Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Now, I'm going to introduce our panelists and then tell you a little bit about how this is set up. Our panelists, and we're delighted to have them here, briefly, Professor Jeff Bilbrough, who's an associate professor of English at Grove City College, editor of Front Porch Republic, author of several books, including, most recently, Reading the Times, a literary and theological inquiry into the news. Then Dr. Andrew Delbanco, Alexander Hamilton Professor of American Studies at Columbia University and president of the Teagle Foundation, many other honors, author of several books, including Melville, His World and Work, and then Professor Robert K. Wallace of Northern Kentucky University, co-founder of the Melville Society Cultural Project at New Bedford Whaling Museum in Massachusetts, past president of Melville Society, author of a great deal as well. Their books are all going to be put into the chat and Q&A at bottom, so you can see what they've written and where you can purchase it and all that good stuff. So I'm not giving you everything they're doing. Now, here's how it's going to be set up. Each of them will speak for about 12 to 14 minutes, and that's in alphabetical order by last name. Following that, a question and answer period moderated by yours truly. That means please put your questions into the chat or the Q&A buttons at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I will then relay them, perhaps adding a question or three of my own, to our panelists. I don't do it in chronological order received. I simply do it in terms of, this seems like a fun question. How do we keep the conversation going? If your questions are not answered by the end of the webinar, please email me and I will, excuse me, and I will pass them on to the professors so they can have the option of answering you directly. And this is going to be recorded so that you can have the chance to see this afterwards as well. So without further ado, I am going to direct you to our fine panelists to talk about Herman Melville's Moby Dick. First, Professor Bilbrough.
Well, thank you, Dave. I'm looking forward to our conversation today. And I'm honored to be talking about Melville, who is someone I admire and enjoy very much. But I think the two gentlemen I'm speaking with today have forgotten more about Melville than I'll ever know. So it'll only get better as we go. One of the questions animating the conversation, the panel today, is why did Moby Dick flop when it was first published? And, you know, if in that case, why is it considered a great American novel today? And as Melville scholars have pointed out, a key reason for that disappointment seems to have been the reputation that Melville developed, especially from his first two novels, Typee and Umu. You know, these are swashbuckling adventure stories set in the South Seas with cannibals, and American readers had got used to that kind of thing from Melville. And as he would write these other novels like Marty or Redburn even, you know, readers just wanted more of the same, the original Melville adventure story. And so when he's returning to this whaling story and back to these topics, readers thought, oh, this is a return to the Melville that we knew from his first novels. And obviously, Moby Dick is not Typee or Umu, right? And in part, I think, as Melville writes this, he becomes really determined to write a novel that explores profound questions of truth and how we might get at truth in a, you know, complex world. And so I often, when I teach this novel, I often begin with this letter that he writes to his friend Nathaniel Hawthorne as he's finishing up Moby Dick. And this is what he says to Hawthorne. Truth is the silliest thing under the sun. Try to get a living by the truth and go to the soup societies. Heavens, let any clergyman try to preach the truth from its very stronghold, the pulpit, and they would ride him out of his church on his own pulpit banister. It can hardly be doubted that all reformers are bottomed upon the truth, more or less. And to the world at large, are not reformers almost universally laughingstocks? Why so? Truth is ridiculous to men. Thus easily in my room here do I, conceited and garrulous, reverse the test of my Lord Shaftesbury. So that's Melville the Hawthorne. So if readers don't like his novel, perhaps Melville would argue that the ridicule heaped by some readers on his Leviathan of a Romance proves or attests to its truthfulness. But one way of sort of getting at the serious aspect of Moby Dick, I think, is how it dramatizes, I guess, the search for truth. And it ends up being a deadly serious book. In fact, all the main characters, except for the narrator, die. And in the British edition, the first British edition, the narrator dies too, which is perhaps one of the reasons why readers there were so confused by the book. I just pulled as an example this brief quote from the Athenaeum from an October 1851 review. Moby Dick is an ill-compounded mixture of romance and matter of fact. The style of Melville's tale is in places disfigured by mad rather than bad English, and its catastrophe is hastily, weakly, and obscurely managed. We have little more to say in reprobation or in recommendation of this absurd book. So, if my students are at first taken aback by the book, I say, well, you're in good company. But then I also invite them, to try to appreciate what Melville is up to and what the novel might have to say about truth, the search for truth, and various ways we might go about that. And one place to begin in the novel is the justly famous Doubloon Chapter, right, where Ahab has earlier in the book nailed a Spanish coin to the mast and promised that whichever crew member, whichever person first spots Moby Dick, they will win the coin, get the coin as a reward. And in this chapter, Captain Ahab and then a whole parade of characters walk up to the coin and try to interpret the images stamped on it. And each walks away with a very different meaning, right? And Pip, his assessment at the end of this parade seems to be fairly correct. He recites the English conjugation of the verb look. I look, you look, he looks, we look, ye look, they look. And the suggestion is that perhaps truth is relative and perspectival, that the meaning of reality, the meaning of any text simply depends upon who is doing the looking. And in that context, in that possibility, Melville gives us a whole set of very vividly drawn characters, which is one of the reasons why the novel has become so beloved. There's such rich characterization. So, for instance, we get Captain Ahab, right? And in the face of the difficulty of discerning truth, he seems to double down on his monomaniacal quest. What is the meaning of this random act of vicious nature? So he does all kinds of things in trying to probe this. He has these philosophical discourses. He does these various religious ceremonies. But his preferred method seems to be striking back at the pasteboard mask of the inscrutable malice that affronted him, right, Moby Dick. And one of the ways that he tries to track down Moby Dick is through these whale charts and through his scientific knowledge of whale behavior. So he's very philosophical, he's very religious, but he's also quite methodical, I guess, in his search for the whale. Maybe in kind of contrast to Ahab, you get characters like Stubb or Flask or Captain Bildad, who more or less seem to bracket the search for truth as perhaps a fool's errand and replace it with more pragmatic quests. For instance, how do I make more money? Flask, for instance, when he's looking at the doubloon and the Doubloon Chapter, calculates how many cigars he could buy with the value of the doubloon, right? The other characters are trying to read the symbolism, and he's just concerned with its cash value. But the most complex view in the novel is certainly Ishmael's. And Ishmael wrestles with a whole range of perspectives on truth. But perhaps one way of boiling down Ishmael's perspective on this question is, what is the meaning of life in the wake of the kind of modern death of divinely ordained meaning? If God is absent or at least ungraspable, what do we do with meaning? And after World War I think, there are other reasons, historical reasons why Moby Dick became more popular. But in part, there was a cultural shift after the war, and Ishmael's questions began to resonate with the broader reading public. And that's at least one explanation for why the novel became more popular in the 20th century. But I just want to sort of mention a set of methods that Ishmael employs to try to get at truth and answer this question. And many of them end up being variations on the modern scientific method. The book's famous opening sentence, for instance, Call Me Ishmael, is actually not the book's opening sentence, right? It begins with two other chapters, one of which is a set of etymologies of the whale, and one of which is a set of extracts about whales. And on the one hand, Melville kind of pokes fun at these. The etymologies are supplied by a late consumptive usher to a grammar school. And the extracts are from a sub librarian, and it's pretty funny, these chapters. And the part of the point of these, as you get introduced to the book, is that they are in utter conflict, and it's not at all clear what the essence or meaning of the whale might be. But these are standard bibliographic methods of trying to understand and make sense of the reality, a complex reality. In the Cytology chapter, Ishmael goes a step further and tries to classify all whales in a sort of encyclopedic fashion with folios and Dewey Decimals and other bookish metaphors. And of course, encyclopedias are an Enlightenment era technology that were designed in response to information overload unleashed by the printing press, and thought to be a way of organizing knowledge and helping us figure out truth. Ishmael kind of gives up near the end of the Cytology chapter. He says, this is, not complete. It's but a draught of a draught. People are going to finish this for me later. Stubb makes a similar comment in the Doubloon chapter, where he's trying to read the almanac to make sense of the doubloon. And he kind of puts the book down, the almanac down. He says, book, you lie there. The fact is, you books must know your place. You'll do to give us the bare words and facts, but we come in to supply the thoughts, right? So you can draw on books, you can try to organize meaning, but again, maybe it comes back to the perspective of the reader. Ishmael supplements all of this bookish learning with experience, right? As a good American, he wants to experience whales for himself. And he says at one point that I've swum through libraries and sailed through oceans, and I have had to do with whales with these visible hands. So he wants to get his hands dirty. And it's this kind of combination of the bookish and the experiential that Ishmael represents. And yet, right, all these accumulated facts about whales, both bookish and experiential, fail to be definitive. They fail to get at the essence of the whale. And I'll just sort of point to two examples where I think this comes through, and Ishmael's kind of dealing with the frustrations of his methodological failings. The first is in the very first chapter, where he begins by talking about the lure he feels to go to water. He wants to go to water. And he says this is actually a very common experience. Humans are naturally drawn to water. And he presents this long list of relevant facts that deal with landscape painting and Greek deities and observed human behavior. And then he concludes by trying to sort of come up with or induce a general purpose that would unite all this disparate evidence about why people are drawn to water. But he doesn't really know. And so he concludes this way: surely all this is not without meaning. And still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting, mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans, it is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life. And this is the key to it all. What is the key to it all, right? All these facts aren't without meaning, he insists, but what exactly their meaning is remains unclear. And his very grammar is ambiguous. What is the it that is this image of the ungraspable phantom of life? And what is exactly the key to it all? So is the meaning of water's pull upon humans the deeper meaning of Narcissus? Is it the image we see, our own image reflected? In a reference back to the Doubloon chapter. It's not clear, right? So he senses that there is some meaning here, but he can't quite put his finger on it. The second, perhaps most famous example is in the Whiteness of the Whale chapter, right? Where Ishmael begins in this beautiful long sentence with 18, I think, more or less, 18 examples of the positive connotations of the color of white, right? This is a good thing about white. This is a good thing. And then he concludes, the last part of the sentence says, there yet lurks an elusive something in the innermost idea of this hue, which strikes more of panic to the soul than that redness which affrights in blood. And then he goes on to develop the idea. But what I think is interesting about the structure there is that he draws this conclusion about the fearfulness of white, despite all the facts he's listed to the contrary. So that induction does not seem an infallible method of discerning truth. And that he's got to make sense of his intuition, his hunch, some other way. So are we doomed to wallow in kind of relativistic perspectival responses to enigmatic reality? Does the novel conclude that truth always eludes our grasp? It's a great novel, yes and no, right? It's complicated. Hawthorne, coming back to Hawthorne, I'll conclude with these couple of observations here. Puts it this way in his journal after his 1856 conversation with Melville. They meet again, they have this long conversation, kind of pick up a friendship that had gone their separate ways. And he makes a very astute observation, I think, about Melville. This is Hawthorne. Melville, as he always does, began to reason of providence and futurity, of everything that lies beyond human ken, and informed me that he pretty much made up his mind to be annihilated, but still he does not seem to rest in that anticipation, and I think will never rest until he gets hold of a definite belief. It is strange how he persists and has persisted ever since I knew him, probably long before, in wandering to and fro over these deserts, as dismal and monotonous as the sandhills amid which we were sitting. He can neither believe nor be comforted in his unbelief, and he's too honest and courageous not to try to do one or the other. So he's conflicted, right? And that's what makes it a great book to discuss and think about. I'll just conclude with this one other observation, which is that while truth proves elusive and perhaps ungraspable, there is this notion that we can yet be grasped by truth, that we can perhaps be found by what we cannot find ourselves. And I'll get at this through just an observation that Pequod's voyage is bookended with references to the incarnation. So it sails on Christmas Day, and then at the end of the voyage, Ahab meets the Rachel, and this ship, the captain has lost his two boys and wants help finding them. Of course, Ahab refuses. But the ship, while cruising for these innocents, these boys that are lost, picks up the castaway Ishmael. And Ishmael is floating on Queequeg's coffin-turned-life buoy, right? Which is engraved with these hieroglyphic symbols that represent a mystical treatise on the art of attaining truth. And yet no one can read this because these marks are from a dead prophet. Even Queequeg cannot read this on his writing. He just inscribes them on his coffin. So the message is unreadable, and yet it still serves to save Ishmael. And, in a similar way, you can think about the incarnation as this moment when truth finds humanity. So maybe Melville is holding out hope that we can be found by a truth we cannot find on our own. But it's this quest for truth. It's this really determined search and honest wrestling with the process of how we know and find truth that I think makes Moby Dick such an enduring novel and an enduring site of conversation.
Great. I think what we've agreed is that I will say some things next, and then Bob Wallace. Thank you, Jeff, for setting up our conversation so well. And I want to both endorse what you've said and depart from it a little bit. I think Jeff has done a really great job of laying out some of the themes, ideas, metaphysical questions, moral and philosophical questions that are very much at stake in this book. for that reason, I'm going to go in a slightly different direction and talk a bit more about, I guess, what we might call style or voice. But my purpose will be to try to make some suggestions about why this book did not connect with very many readers at the time it was published in the middle of the 19th century. But it has, as we all know, connected with millions and millions of readers in the 20th century and 21st century, as Jeff said, beginning more or less in the years following the First World War. So let me start by just putting a few particulars down on that point. If you go to the library and you check out or just browse through the multi-volume Cambridge History of American Literature that was published in 1917, you go to the index and you will find Melville, but you'll find only some very brief mentions of Melville, who is presented essentially as a minor writer of South Seas adventure stories. And the authors had in mind those early books that Jeff alluded to, Typee and Omu, which were sort of minor bestsellers in their own time. But that's it. I mean, the towering figure who we know today as arguably the biggest figure in American literature, I mean, Henry James might give him a run for his money in the 19th century, is nowhere to be seen there. And it was only in the years following the war that he begins to come back into view. Actually, interestingly enough, initially noticed by readers and critics in England. At my own university, was a well-known writer and scholar, Mark Van Doren, who had written about Nathaniel Hawthorne. And when a graduate student came to him named Raymond Weaver and said, what should I do for a dissertation? Van Doren said something like, well, there's this guy Melville that, people are beginning to take notice of him. There really isn't a good book about him. Why don't you try a Melville biography? And Weaver went ahead and did that. And that was part of the reason that we saw a Melville revival beginning in the mid 1920s. So the question arises, what do we make of this? Why did he connect then, but not before? And I'll say one other preliminary remark about this before I venture a couple of provisional answers to that question. About 40 years ago or so, a critic named Jane Tompkins wrote an interesting little book in which she suggested, perhaps somewhat mischievously, I'm not sure how serious she was about it, that we ought to consider rewriting our literary history in the following way. You would cover writers not in the chapter about the period in which they lived necessarily, but in the period in which they began to matter, in which they began to count for the culture. So if you followed that procedure, for example, there would be a long chapter about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin when you were writing about the 1850s, because there was a book that really touched a nerve in pre-Civil War America on the issue of race and the coming conflict between North and South, sold thousands and thousands of copies in the first few days. And yet it's a book that today, although it's an important cultural artifact, probably not very many people would defend it on literary or even moral grounds in terms of the stereotypical representation of African Americans and the sentimentality of the narrative and so on. It doesn't cut it for us except as an historical artifact. So you'd write about Stowe in your 19th century chapter and you'd leave her out in your 20th century chapter. With Melville, you'd do the opposite. You'd skip over him in the 1850s because nobody much was paying attention. But by the time you get to the 1930s and 40s and 50s, Melville would be all over your book because he's there for many American writers in a way that counted a great deal. Okay, so why this weirdly distorted life history of this book? And there are many answers to that question, but the one I want to try out on you has to do with the author's voice. I would go out on a limb and say that no one had encountered a voice like this from a putatively respectable writer before Melville came on the scene. Now, what do I mean by that? And here we risk, all we can do is describe and paraphrase, and you can never really capture that voice unless you hear it in and of itself. So in a minute, I'm going to read you a short passage, use a few of my own minutes to let you hear Melville, which is time much better spent than listening to me. But lines like, "Give me a condor's quill. Give me Vesuvius's crater as an inkstand," right? "I am so large, I am such a gigantic imagination that there's no way to contain me." The only other American writer of the 19th century who begins to sound like that comes a few years later, and that's Walt Whitman, who writes in something like the same voice in poetry, but he wasn't known yet. So Melville was really out front on this. At one point he says that I'm paraphrasing here, for which I should be forgiven, "You can't write a mighty book unless you have a mighty theme." And Jeff has alluded to some of the aspects of that mighty theme. What is truth? Are we alone in the universe? How do we understand the purpose of our lives? What do we make of the fact that we feel so puny in the face of this oceanic immensity that he describes in the novel? So he had a mighty theme, and he knew it. He wrote about it with confidence and bravado, braggadocio, you might say. Sort of he's in the reader's face in a way that no American writer had been previously. So that's part of it. I think he was alarming and frightening and off-putting to a lot of readers of the time who expected a novel to be contained, respectable, conventional narrative that you could follow, characters whom you could get involved with. This book was nothing like that. It's got characters who show up and seem to be getting ready to play a very significant role in the story, and then they disappear. I'm thinking of one in particular, a figure named Bulkington, who's introduced early in the novel. You get the feeling, it's like with a drum roll, you get the feeling this guy's going to play an important role in the drama. And then Melville just decides to get rid of him and writes a short chapter and says, this 6-inch chapter, referring to the amount of space on the page it's taking up, this 6-inch chapter is Bulkington's stoneless grave. And I often say to my students, okay, if he's decided that this character is not going to work out, why wouldn't he just cut that earlier section? Most editors would say to you, this is confusing to the reader, get rid of that early chapter about this guy because you've decided he's not going to play a big role in the story. But no, Melville decides to announce his departure from the narrative. And I ask my students now, why might that be? And we generally arrive at something like the following conclusion. Because one of the things that this book is about, it's about how the human mind works. And in that way, he was, as great artists are, ahead of his time. He was thinking about the mind somewhat the way Sigmund Freud would be thinking about it 50 and 60 years later. That is, no experience that we have in our lives ever disappears. It goes subterranean. It goes below the surface. It gets transmogrified into something else, perhaps, but it never goes away. So when he just says, Bulkington is here, but we're going to set him aside, we're going to shunt him aside, he's trying to approximate the way the mind works with memory and experience. And this was not something that readers of 1850 were used to. Now, let me give you, in Melville's own words, a different kind of illustration of what I'm trying to talk about. This is chapter 14. It's a short chapter. It's one of my favorites. It's called Nantucket. And one of the things I say to my students and the question might arise outside the classroom, what's the point of literary biography? Why would you bother, as I sort of did, to write a book about the life of the writer? And one answer I give to that question is, well, when you get to this chapter on Nantucket, it's helpful to know that when Melville wrote it, he had never been to Nantucket. Okay? That tells you that what you're about to read is not a journalistic description of a place that he has seen. It's something else. So what is it? Let me read you just one paragraph, and then we can talk maybe later in the Q&A about what you think it is. Nantucket. Take out your map and look at it. He's immediately playing games with the reader, right? Because he's saying, all we have of Nantucket is a map, a representation of Nantucket. So take out this map and look at it. You're not looking at Nantucket, you're looking at something else. See what a real corner of the world it occupies, how it stands there way offshore, more lonely than the Eddystone Lighthouse. Look at it, a mere hillock, an elbow of sand, all beach, without a background. There's more sand there than you would use in 20 years as a substitute for blotting paper. Some gamesome whites will tell you that they have to plant weeds there. They don't grow naturally, that they import Canada thistles, that they have to send beyond seas for a spile to stop a leak in an oil cask, that pieces of wood in Nantucket are carried about like bits of the True Cross in Rome, that people there plant toadstools before their houses to get under the shade in summertime, that one blade of grass makes an oasis, 3 blades in a day's walk a prairie, that they wear quicksand shoes, something like Laplander snowshoes, that they're so shut up, belted about, every way enclosed, surrounded, and made an utter island of by the ocean, that to their very chairs and tables, small clams will sometimes be found adhering as to the backs of sea turtles. Now, if I had been trained as a singer or a wind instrument player, I would have been able to read that in one breath, which is the way you should read it. It's a breathless effusion of images and ideas that come into his mind when he thinks about the idea of Nantucket. And it's wonderful, isn't it? I mean, these mushrooms instead of trees are providing the shade, and you need quicksand shoes rather than snowshoes. And if you find a little piece of wood, it's like finding a relic of the cross because it's such a barren desert place. None of this has anything to do with the reality of Nantucket. And he knows that. This is a description of his mind at work, just as, in a way, the whole book is. So he gives you this effusion, which I sometimes compare with my students to the performance by a great jazz musician who does a riff on a melody, and just the sheer joy of letting these associations tumble out of his mind in response to this idea is infectious. And I feel it myself when I read this aloud. And then after all of that, he concludes with this wonderful closing sentence. But these extravaganzas only show that Nantucket is no Illinois. I mean, so I wanted to read that to you because it gets us to a place in Melville's temperament, I think, that's really important to keep in mind. First of all, it's charming, it's joyful, it's self-deprecating because he knows he doesn't know anything about Nantucket, and he can't fool anybody. And he sort of punctures his own excitement with that last sentence, almost like a child who's been having a tantrum and somebody comes along and says, okay, enough. Now sit down and take a breath and let's come back to reality. So there are many other passages that I could read to you, and I won't because we have very limited time. But there are many different voices in this book: humorous, tragic, lyrical, terrifying. And in all of them, he just lets himself go, and he doesn't worry very much about the consecutive narrative that connects them or doesn't connect them, or whether characters disappear or reappear. There are chapters about, Ishmael, the narrator, reporting things that he couldn't possibly know, because he couldn't possibly be in the cabin with Captain Ahab knowing what Ahab is saying to his officers. But that doesn't bother Melville, because he's not playing by the rules of realistic fiction that his readers expected. As you all know, you get to the 20th century and you find a lot of writers starting to write in this way, where they're interested in the phrase that came into circulation later on, stream of consciousness. They're interested in the way the mind operates more than describing what the room looks like or the furniture or the dialogue, as we would expect in a conventional novel. So those are some of the reasons that I think he didn't make it in his own time, and he did make it later on. He's sort of the irresistible classic case of the great genius, unrecognized by contemporaries and embraced by posterity. And there is a large sense in which I think he knew that this was going to be true of himself. He knew that he had left his audience behind. And of course, he had his disappointments about that. But I think finally he came to terms with it. Last thing I would say is that, I guess one of the questions that's at stake in this series of seminars that you're having is what is a great novel, or what's the measure of a novel that allows us to say it's great. And I go to a comment made by a great critic, Frank Kermode, who wrote a little book called The Classic 50 years ago or so, in which he cuts through all the complications about, what books are worth reading and what books are not worth reading, that English professors spend a lot of time arguing about. And he says, a classic is a book that's read a long time after it was written. Period. Now, America has a very short history. So this book was written 62 years ago, 61 years ago. That's a long time in American history. It's not the thousands of years that we've been reading Homer or Dante, or the hundreds in which we've been reading Shakespeare, but it's a long time in American history. The book is read by every generation, and every generation finds in it, sort of like in that Doubloon chapter that Jeff talked about, a reflection of itself. It finds in the 1930s its preoccupation with violence and genocide. It finds in the 1950s the ideological conflict between the West and the Soviet bloc. It finds in more recent years themes of sexual adventurousness and what once would have been called non-normative sexuality. There are homosocial or homosexual themes in this book. It finds insight into America's racial conflict. This is, after all, a book about a crew that is working on behalf of the dominant American industry of the 1840s, the whaling industry, and all the members of this crew, not all, but many of the members of this crew would be persons, as we would describe them today, persons of color. So it's a book about sex, it's a book about race, it's a book about politics, demagoguery, democracy, its pluses and minuses, and every generation finds in it something that speaks to its own dilemma. If that doesn't make it a great American novel, I don't know what would. So thanks a lot, and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Professor Wallace.
Thank you. Well, it's a real honor to be speaking after Jeffrey and Andrew, and I hope what I say will echo some of what Jeff was exploring in Melville as a truth seeker, and what Andy's been saying about Melville's language being ultimately liberating, but meaning different things to different generations of readers. So I would say, based on my own experience as a teacher and scholar, it is still a great American novel. I've taught Moby Dick for 49 years at Northern Kentucky University, and the novel, I would say, has become greater over that time, but for different reasons to each generation of students. In the 1970s, students tended to read it as an adventure story that helped them think about America's place in the world. In the 80s, they became interested in the racial and homosocial issues in the novel. Some students were very interested, and others were quite uncomfortable about whatever it was Ishmael and Queequeg were doing in bed. That generation was really worried about that. In the 1990s, students were increasingly comfortable with Ishmael and Queequeg, but becoming highly concerned about the killing of the whales, and also the implications of what Ishmael calls the all-grasping Western world. In the early 21st century, everyone loves Queequeg. Ishmael has supplanted Ahab as the main character in the book, and Moby Dick the whale has become the soul of the ocean and an inspiration for mankind. One special feature of my teaching over the years began with an art major in my class in Moby Dick and the Arts in 1994. He said, you know, I'm an art major, can I do a painting instead of one of those research papers? And I said yes, and he did 2 great paintings. So I made that option open to future students. Ever since then, a majority of students have surprised me by tending to take the artistic option. For the last 10 years, you'll get about 12 out of the 15 who will do artwork or either verbal art or visual or even musical composition, sometimes dance. And I've discovered that the students who do this each uniquely make the novel their own. Now, it's possible to do that by writing a research paper, but it's a different process when somebody goes into themselves and wants to make an artwork in response to the novel. So this has been invigorating to me as a teacher. In 2015, we had an exhibition of 105 artworks by 52 of my students over a 20-year period in a local public library. So I've been a scholar and curator of Moby Dick and the Arts for almost 40 years. Today, the interest in Moby Dick is stronger and more diverse than ever among both visual and performing artists. With visual art, in 1995, Elizabeth Schultz published a book called Unpainted to the Last. Until that book came out, nobody had any idea how many American artists had responded to Moby Dick during the 20th century. In the 25 years since that, you could write a book as long as that one was. It seems that only the Holy Bible has inspired so many visual responses as Moby Dick has. So I'll share a few examples after Schultz's book came out. In 1997, Frank Stella completed his Moby Dick series. He created 1 or more artworks for every chapter of the novel. These were painted reliefs, multimedia prints, and freestanding sculptures. The project took him 12 years. Stella, in this process, Moby Dick helped Stella to escape from what he had come to see as the dead end of artistic abstractionism that he had excelled in the first 25 years of his own career. In 2011, Matt Kish published Moby Dick in Pictures, 1 drawing for every page. Kish drew 1 new drawing on 1 new piece of found paper for 500 consecutive days. He combines popular culture with visual sophistication, and his book has been very popular with a great variety of audiences. In 2020, Aileen Callahan created 70 watercolors in the series she is calling Moby Dick in Days of Pestilence and Chaos. That was her response to the first year of the pandemic in which we're still living. She exhibited her first large Moby Dick painting 20 years earlier at an international Melville conference in 2001. So I'll give 3 quick highlights from performance art. In 2001, Randy Eckert premiered And God Created Great Whales. That was a 2-person chamber opera for which he wrote the libretto, composed the music, and sang and acted the primary role. That was the role of Nathan, who's a piano tuner with a progressive neurological disease who's trying to complete a Moby Dick opera before he dies. He has an African-American opera singer as his female muse. In 2010, Jake Hagee and Gene Shear premiered their grand opera entitled Moby Dick. It has 5 principal roles that are equally important. Ahab and Starbuck are the white officers who are clashing over the purpose of the voyage. Queequeg, Ishmael, and Pip are the multiracial trio of crew members who represent the future and the hope of humanity. In 2021, this year we have Deep Blue Sea. This is a full-length dance program written and choreographed by Bill T. Jones. It premiered last week at the Armory in New York. Obviously, I've not had a chance to see it, but Jones has declared that the oceanic vision of this work was directly inspired by Moby Dick in general and by Pip, its black cabin boy, in particular. Pip, in fact, plays an important role in all three of the above performance pieces. The first major piece about Pip by one of my students was the Pip Trilogy by Kathleen Pearcefield, a printmaker in my 2004 class. She exhibited her Pip Trilogy in a 3-person art show in Rockford, Illinois in 2009, and at our exhibition in Northern Kentucky 6 years later. So the question is, why does Moby Dick still inspire so many students and artists in so many different ways? My shorter answer is because Melville did not go to college. He was not taught the academic platitudes of his age. Like Ishmael and Moby Dick, the whale ship was his Harvard College and his Yale. On the whale ship, young Melville was in daily active contact with people from all ends of the earth for 3 full years. This made him a humanist. Young Melville saw the French Navy and English language missionaries destroying the indigenous culture of the Marquesa Islands in order to impose their own Western one. This made him a post-colonial critic during the early years of capitalist colonialism. Young Melville saw and felt the deep rhythms of the oceanic world, which he and his crewmates had invaded in order to seek out and kill its largest and most sophisticated creatures for commercial profit. This made him an ecologist. So my general conclusion is that Moby Dick is still a great novel because our world needs Melville's humanistic, post-colonial, and ecological insights more than ever, and our students and our artists know that. So I want to close with one postscript and one emendation. In 1968, I was a PhD candidate in 19th century literature at Columbia University. I proposed a dissertation on Moby Dick, and my professors rejected the idea because they said there's nothing new to be said about that book. I am very glad that my own students for 50 years and living artists for 40 years have shown me that those professors were wrong. I would amend today's topic to suggest that Moby Dick is a great global novel. In 2018, Onyinye Owula was a sophomore psychology major and honors minor in my class in Moby Dick and the Arts. As her final project, she created one haiku for every chapter title of the novel in the Pidgin English of her native Nigeria. 1 year later, a large section of her narrative poem was published in an anthology of new Moby Dick poetry. The book launch was in the rare book room of the Strand Bookstore in New York City, and Oni read from her poem as part of the 13th International Melville Society Conference hosted by New York University. Since then, essays about her poem have been published in 2 different international journals. The title and first line of Oni's poem is Ishmael Mana Nam. This means, call me Ishmael in Nigerian Pidgin. Her poem ends with these 3 words, Rachel, rescue me. Pidgin English is the language in which Ishmael and Queequeg would have communicated with each other and their crewmates on the Pequod. It is the one foreign language that young Melville had to learn on the whale ship that was his Harvard College in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the early 1840s. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Excuse me. Lovely hearing all of your talks. I will encourage everybody who is listening, please put more questions into the chat and Q&A at the bottom, and I'll pass them along. Now, I'll pass along a first question from Dr. Joseph Pearson, condensing a twiddle. Why the fascination with Moby Dick? And asking the panelists, well, to wax autobiographical, why are you interested in Moby Dick? What caught you about him? I must say, I'm not a panelist, but I'll just say, I happened to read him while traveling through the Netherlands in my early 20s. And I got to read the comparison with of a whale skeleton with the great church in Haarlem, right before going to the great church in Haarlem. It was wonderful. And just glorious prose, obviously. But the three of you, and I guess the same order, Professor Bilbrow first, what caught you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we have to begin with what Andrew talked about, which is the voice and the language and the style. I mean, his the Call Me Ishmael famously, kind of grabs the reader by the collar and doesn't let go. So I think it's funny, it's sad, it's sacrilegious at times. So it's just this style, and it weaves together the working class, uneducated kind of language with Shakespeare and the Bible and all these classical allusions. So I think the language is certainly a place to start for me. It was part of how I got into it. But then, the more I read and thought about Melville, and the more I realized this is sort of like Shakespeare. There are all these depths, right? You never exhaust the novel. So every time I reread it to teach it, new facets catch my attention.
Well, since you've invited us to indulge ourselves in a little autobiography, I'm not going to try to tell you a life story, but you've said it's okay to talk about ourselves for a minute in connection with this question. So, I guess I wear a number of hats, scholar with a small s for sure, teacher, now manager of an organization, I guess. But the truth is, I think my first identity in this context anyway is as a writer. And it was as a aspiring writer, not consciously, teenager thinking, oh, I want to be a writer someday, but a kid who found words interesting that I first connected to Melville. And it is, as Jeff just said, it is about the voice for me. I just find myself, when I read Melville, either silently to myself or aloud, as I did earlier to this group or to my students, I find myself just continually amazed by what he does with the words. It's in the way, I went to a concert when I was a kid with somebody who played a string instrument, and we went to hear, it was Jascha Heifetz and Grigor Piatigorsky in a chamber music concert. And the person I went with spent the whole time shaking his head in disbelief about what these two guys were able to do with the instrument, the sound that they were able to get out of the instrument. And for me, that's where it begins with Melville. It's just, I'll give you one, just from memory, here's one question, one example. There's the quarterdeck chapter that I think Jeff alluded to, which it does indeed have a deep metaphysical content, but it's also a great sort of operatic drama as this figure whom you've been hearing about all through the early chapters of the novel, but nobody has seen him yet, right? And then suddenly he reveals himself to the crew after the ship is safely out of port and out to sea. He reveals himself to the crew, and Melville sums up the occasion with a 3-word sentence. reality outran apprehension. Reality outran apprehension. You know, we could work for 40 years and not come up with that succinct, concrete sentence that captures the whole psychological drama of the mass anxiety and how this guy is playing the crew like a fiddle. And we discover later in the chapter that he's going to convince them that his personal voyage of vengeance needs to become theirs as well. And we could talk about that if you like. But it's just that ability, after all this florid, long sentences and complicated paragraphs that go all over the place, he comes up with this 3-word sentence that just nails it to the wall. So for me, that's what got me into Melville. And there are very few writers who have that effect on me, even to the present day. And even as often as I've read it, every time I read it again, I'm continually amazed. So that's my best answer to why Melville for me.
Professor Wallace?
First, I should confess that I first read Melville in high school and hated it. The student pushed us through it. The teacher pushed us through it. And I really resisted the book. I didn't like it at all. And it changed for me in college for 2 reasons. One, I had a really great teacher, a professor at Whitman College, had a master's degree, could not get a job today because we require PhDs, but he's the best teacher I've ever encountered. And I was going to be a lawyer. I was a poli-sci major, and I got almost all A's. He gave me a B in American literature, one of my few B's, but he made the subject so interesting, I thought I might want to be a college teacher instead of a lawyer. So like his teaching in Moby Dick was an important part of that transition in my life. But the other reason the book meant more to me in college is that in high school and college, I worked on tugboats in Puget Sound. And in the summers, I was 15 days on and 15 off, these long voyages, towing logs and barges up and down Puget Sound. And I had the mates watch from midnight to 6, and from 6 to, and from noon, midnight to 6, and then it must have been from noon to 6 again. Watching the actual motions of the universe while you're talking to a working man, not another educated person, for 6 hours at a time to stay awake during the night, it got me to apprehend the natural world directly and the human world much more broadly, so that I could appreciate Melville's appreciation for crew members, as well as for the high intellectual drama that's also going on in Moby Dick. So those 2 things came together for me my junior year in college, that I decided to turn down Harvard and Yale Law School and become an English teacher, which my father never got over. Well, he got over it maybe 25 years after. So the other thing is, you know, what made it work inside for me was something Jeffrey and Andy have certainly mentioned, the language. I mean, it's so fresh. And I can think of 2 things about the language come to mind right now. Once I wrote a book about Stella's series and interviewed him for 6 years. It was a great process. And early on, I said, you know, you've been spending a decade on this book that's pretty dark. Everyone dies in the end, but Ishmael, and didn't you find it depressing at times to be in this book for so long? And he said, you know, I didn't find it depressing at all, because every sentence is alive, you know? I mean, so Melville's mind is so active, whatever element of this wide-ranging story he's telling. And then Andrew mentioned the quarterdeck scene, and that his sense of drama, but to do intense drama in high-minded language is a difficult thing to do. And one of the great things about Hagee's and Shearer's opera that they found when they did the quarterdeck scene, or the symphony scene when Starbuck and Ahab are talking, or the musket scene when Starbuck's thinking about killing Ahab, which is the end of Act 1, and just heartbreaking to watch him. So much more moving actually in the opera than in the book. They use Melville's direct language. They set that language directly to words, and it works as sung opera, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. With Ishmael, Queequeg, and Pip, they had to create relationships on the ship that didn't exist in the book and create their own modern language that would blend with Melville's language straight out of the book. And the fact that Gene Shearer could write that and Jake Hagee could set that is one thing that makes their opera so great. So all those elements are what some of the things that make Moby Dick seem really special to me as I've observed it over the years.
Thank you. I am going to go on to a question from Majid Farman Farmayan. Does Professor Del Banco perhaps allude to Melville writing impressionistically? And if so, perhaps Impressionism needed to take root in the late 19th century before he could be fully appreciated. I just want to push that a little bit. And then for all three, are Melville's stylistic innovations characteristic of the move in literature and the fine arts in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, or is he his own? Is he doing his own thing?
Well, on the Impressionism question, I would certainly prefer to defer to Bob, who has thought more deeply about Melville's relation to the visual arts, both artists whom he knew and artists whom he in some ways anticipated than probably anybody else. I take the point of the question that if by Impressionism we mean, and people seem to mean a lot of different things by that term, but the attempt to paint, or there were Impressionistic composers as well as Impressionistic painters, the attempt to express what we see or feel or hear or experience without deploying the intellect to go beyond the surface to discover the force behind the appearance, then yes, in some ways Melville was impressionistic, and this is of course what makes him so great, he's always contradicting himself. He's also the opposite of an impressionist because he's, as we know from that great passage that Jeff read from Hawthorne's notebook, he was restless in his unbelief. He was continually on a quest to understand what was behind the pasteboard mask, if anything. So he was interested in the surfaces and to find a way to use language to describe impressions, but he didn't stop there either. So in that respect, I think it's fair to call him a proto-impressionist, I guess, but only up to a point. Just quickly on the second part of David's question, if I understood you correctly, is there a way in which Melville sort of set the agenda for subsequent writers and moved literature in a direction that it would then follow? I think you can say that, but if you think I mentioned Henry James earlier. I mean, Henry James is another very great writer who was very profoundly interested in the labyrinth of the human mind, but stylistically, what could be more different than if you put James and Melville next to each other? It's almost, calling them both prose writers is kind of misleading because they're doing something completely different, though, yes, perhaps in pursuit of the same object, which is to get to a realism that goes below the surface. It's not to describe social circumstances, it's to try to get inside the mind itself. So yes, as far as I know, James took next to no notice of Melville and mentions him once, I think, in passing in one of his critical essays. But Melville really didn't have a lot of impact on writers and artists until well into the 20th century. And an example of Frank Stella is a great one. So he was kind of out there on his own for a long time, I think.
Other people want to take a crack at that question?
Well, Andrew's answer makes me think in the visual arts, I think there's a really interesting example of Melville in the times, and that is the painting in the Spouter Inn, where when I started teaching in 73 or so, the first time I taught the novel, we get to that passage and I had a really angry student. He says, why does the guy spend 3 paragraphs on that damn painting and he still can't say what it means at the end? Because Melville gives us the process of seeing the image. He gives us the perceptual reality of it without putting an interpretation on it. He offers a final theory of my own based on what he saw in conversations with strangers and all of that. But it was the indefiniteness of the painting that made it real. And what is so interesting about that, it was a very abstract painting for 1851, to be sure. There weren't paintings like that in American galleries, but there were in England with J.M.W. Turner, who in the 1840s was painting in that kind of abstract style to reach beyond the pasteboard mask of labeled reality. And partly just to show how nature looks, but what you can actually see, not what you know is behind it from the books or something. So Melville was able to freshen his eye in the way that Turner did. And so it was funny that day in class, I didn't quite know what to say, but I had seen the whale ship, Turner's painting at the Met when I was in graduate school. So I got a slide of that and other late Turners, and I brought it into class the next day and said he was painting, it was like this. This is what he's trying to convey, because Turner's pictures showed it better than my words could, the kind of reality Melville was trying to portray. And in that way, he was way ahead, certainly, of American viewers and of most art critics also. You know, Ruskin was one of the few people really embracing that late Turner style when it was happening. So I was delighted when I started researching Melville's print collection to find that he acquired 30 engravings after prints by Turner, so that my intuition that there was something going on there was important. So he picked up these fresh insights from the natural world, from people like Stubb, who were so ordinary, obnoxious people on the boats. He learned a lot from them, from other writers way back to Shakespeare and way ahead to a few people he could learn from, but he was snatching it from everywhere and making it his own. So in that way, and his ability to riff on things, just playfully riff, was very jazz-like and early, and there wasn't a lot of that going on, certainly in American fiction at the time either.
Professor Bilbrough, can I get you for 3 for 3?
Yeah, I would just echo what they've said. That I think, and Andrew actually talked about this in his first go-round, that part of what's going on is Melville is trying to portray and represent how the mind works and how we make meaning of things, and how he talked about this with the Bulkington episode, right? So I think in that sense, it is kind of proto-impressionistic, because the Impressionists are interested in painting not just what is out there, but also how it is that it makes an impression upon us, how it is that we perceive it. So, yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I think, accurate to put him in that conversation from Turner to the sort of official Impressionists. And I think that scene that Robert was just talking about with the painting of Spouter Inn, which is just a great couple of paragraphs. It's absolutely brilliant. I always try to spend some time with my students on those paragraphs, because what he is doing is sort of walking through all the ways that we can extract meaning from an obscure work of art or an obscure experience that we've had, an opaque, enigmatic, complicated thing. And it really sets up what happens in the Doubloon chapter and what happens in numerous other places where Ishmael in particular, but other characters are trying to make meaning, trying to render the blubber of the whale into something that is useful. And it's that act that he's so perplexed by, but fascinated with, and it's complicated, right? How it is that we make meaning or get at the interpretation of a work of art. So it makes sense that then in his own artistic form, he is trying to find a form that sort of foregrounds the act of meaning making.
Thank you. I am going to go to a question from Carol Iannone. What do you make of Father Mapple's sermon and how it figures in the story? And indeed, and I'll extend, and if you have written on this or you have taught this in particular, love to hear how precisely you have written and taught about it. Why not reverse order? Professor Wallace first this time.
Well, I haven't written about Father Mapple's sermon at any great length, but I have written about Melville's encounter in the Black Church in chapter 2, because it turns out, everyone who wrote a novel about New Bedford and dealt with a church would have the Seaman's Bethel, where a famous minister gave sermons to the sailors before they went out to go whaling. Melville's the only one whose protagonist stumbles into a Black church by accident and feels embarrassed and gets out of there. It turns out that was Frederick Douglass's church. Douglass in that year was a preacher. He was listed not as a workman, which we think of him in New Bedford, before he went to a year later joined up with Garrison, but he was actually listed as a preacher in the city hall because in the city directory, because he had joined the AME Zion Church down on the waterfront, right near where the inns were. So it's really interesting that Melville not only gave us Father Mapple, but gave us the church that happened to Frederick Douglass's, and it shows the capaciousness of his imagination. Mapple's sermon is a great set piece, and it's very complicated. And of course, the Jonah story is so appropriate to the novel. But then it becomes really interesting when Mapple goes from Jonah to the role of the preacher as the truth teller. And it's a double-stranded story. And one thing that I find really interesting is that if you're reading the novel thinking of the fugitive slave law and the fact that slaves were being sent back to the South, even from Massachusetts, and of the fact that Melville's father-in-law, Lemuel Shaw, who hated slavery, felt he had no way to avoid sending slaves back, which he did with George Latimer in 42 and Thomas Sims in 51. And also Daniel Webster, who'd been a great freedom-fighting senator in Massachusetts in the early 40s, he agreed with the South in passing the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850 and really disillusioned the Massachusetts liberals who had been for him. Well, as Father Mapple is saying, what the real seeker of truth has to do, what he has to do as a preacher to follow truth, is to pluck the truth from the robes of senators and justices. And so that really speaks in the current political controversy of fugitive slave law to what's going on with his father-in-law and Daniel Webster. So I think it's Mapple tells us it's a double-stranded lesson, but it's like a quadruple-stranded lesson with so many things that Melville's layering in there. So I think it can be interpreted in many different ways. What is it he's finally up to in that sermon?
Well, it's a little bit irresistible for me because I don't know if Bob deliberately teed this up, but my most recent full-scale piece of writing is a book about the fugitive slave problem and the fugitive slave law in particular, and called The War Before the War. And people ask me, so how did I get interested in that subject? And the honest answer is the one that Bob just inadvertently gave, which is to say, when I was working on Melville, I was interested in the fact that, as Bob just said, his father-in-law, Lemuel Shaw, was this figure in this intolerable situation of being personally, he found slavery to be a loathsome and inhuman institution, and yet he correctly or incorrectly interpreted his constitutional duty to mean that he had to send fugitives back to their legally rightful owners, because the Constitution contains a clause that says that that's an obligation. So I was interested in that, and it sort of festered in my mind for many years, and I went back to the subject, and I think Melville actually never let it go. I think there's a good argument, and other scholars have made this argument in a much more elaborate way than I have, that Melville returned to the theme late in his life with Billy Budd in the person of Captain Vere, who has certain characteristics in common with his father-in-law, Judge Shaw. So yes, I think the moral imperative that Father Mapple articulates in that sermon is something that haunted Melville and made him think deeply about what it means to be a person on the one hand in the world who has to make the compromises and accommodations that we all have to make in order to live in the world, and also a person of faith and conviction who believes in this all-knowing and all-judging God who sees through all the pretenses and can bring sin out of its hiding places, as he does with Jonah. How do you reconcile these two elements of life? And I mean, Mapple doesn't really explore that tension. Mapple gives what's pretty close to a rip-roaring fire and brimstone neo-Calvinist sermon. And Melville, appreciated that a lot. I mean, you can tell how much he valued the oratory, and there's evidence that he heard a preacher named Edward Taylor give sermons very like the one that he describes in that chapter. So he's tapping into a deep American tradition there by putting that sermon smack in the middle of what we're calling a great American novel. Whether he buys it and feels that, this guy's got the answer is another question. But he certainly does a good job of, when I want to teach Puritanism to my students, I spend a certain amount of time on Jonathan Edwards and his predecessors, but in a way, the best example I can give them is Father Mapple. Or Maple, I'm never sure quite how we're supposed to pronounce his name. So it's a great, as Bob said, it's a great set piece. And it kind of sits there, as do certain other chapters, like the Town Hose story, that, you could read them as separate freestanding literary works. But when you put them in the context of the novel, they look different and they feel different. They feel inconclusive in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. So that's my best I can do with that one.
Yeah, I would just concur and add, I think one of the points of that second strand about Jonah and the burden that Father Mapple sees laid on Jonah is that there's clearly an element that Ishmael sees himself as this truth teller, right? Who has this obligation not to be a castaway while preaching to others. So, right in the context of the broader Jonah themes in the story, right? I think then you can see some interesting ways that the sermon sets up those. But also, I would just add that stylistically, it's interesting too, because of course, one of the reasons why it's such a delight to read is that it has these very clear oratorical tropes that you would hear in a sermon. It has the theological and the biblical language. And then of course it has the seafaring, sailor language, he has this whole anaphora with delight is to him, right? Who gives no quarter to the truth, delight, top gallant delight is to him, right? There's these seafaring or whaling language that comes in. And so I think that sets you up then for the rest of the novel, where Ishmael is going to try to make sense of the blubber and the experience of whaling through imagery drawn from Jonah or Ecclesiastes or Job. In that one, I think this is the Grand Armada whaling part. He has these descriptions of 3 bits of board suspended from these from the whaling lines, like the weights on a 8-day clock or something. But then he's also quoting Leviathan sections from Job, and so you get this cross-grained style, I guess, with the highs and the lows. And I should just say, part of what first drew my attention to this is Robert Alter's Pen of Iron. He's got this great essay, or this great book about the influence of the KJV on American authors, and a great chapter there on Melville's language. So I think his reading of the sermon and its linguistic style is helpful.
If I may, this turn in the conversation provokes me to remark that, we've been talking about the multiple dimensions of Melville and all the different ways in which he takes literary possibilities further than perhaps any of his contemporaries in this novel. One dimension of the novel, and I think it's undeniably there, is that this is a political allegory.
Yeah.
Bob has made reference to his own best teacher. The best teacher I ever had was a scholar named Alan Heimert, who wrote a very influential article about Moby Dick 60 years ago now, in which he argued that, in fact, he didn't mean to say that this would exhausted the significance of the book, but that one dimension of the book was that the characters were very specifically tied in Melville's imagination to political figures of the moment. So, as I recall, if I got this right, Allen associated Bulkington with Thomas Hart Benton, the senator from Missouri. Daniel Webster has been mentioned. It's kind of in the book in a number of different ways, this figure who was trying to find some kind of compromise between the slave society and the free North to avoid the catastrophic collision between the two. And most provocatively, Allen argued that Ahab is modeled on none other than John C. Calhoun.
Right.
This monomaniacal, brilliant orator who could see through all the arguments and temporal evasions that everybody else was putting out there, but who was also a madman leading this ship of state. And that is, after all, what it is. I mean, Allen points out, Melville describes the crew of the Pequod as isolatos federated along one keel. And there are 30 of them, or at least, well, the number fluctuates a little bit, but right. There are 30. So there were 30 states in 1850 federated along one keel, and out comes this maniacal captain. And I'm hardly the first to suggest this, as I say, Allen was, but I loved putting an image of Calhoun in the book. And, you look at that image with the wild, wide eyes and the hair flying and the determined look in his eyes. Ahab looks a lot like Calhoun. So Melville, among all the other things he was doing, metaphysics and psychology and lyric poetry and drama and everything else that's going in the book, it's also a political allegory of the events that are unfolding at exactly that moment around, as Bob was saying, the Compromise of 1850, where the debates were happening in Washington as he wrote the book. Yeah. And he certainly knew what was going on. And that's one dimension of the book as well.
Now, I'll just add to what Andy just said, is that in his third novel, Marty, it actually becomes a literal political allegory where he's talking about Congress. And I think Calhoun is Senator Nullo or something. So in Typee, his first novel, he was very explicit in criticizing the French invaders of the Marquesas and the English missionaries, and his American publisher made him revise the novel and take all that stuff out, so that he had this very direct political commentary in his mind as he was writing all of his novels, and he had to make it increasingly indirect. But there's no question that that is a very big factor that is filtering in, because the 50s were a tough time, and he was sublimating all of those energies into various elements of the novel.
And in Mardi, the political allegory is a little more clumsy, right? I mean, they're going to these different islands, and it's like this island very clearly symbolizes the U.S. or the other nations.
Right.
It's kind of clunky. It's interesting, but by the time it gets to Melville, as you say, it's much more sublimated, or it's much more sophisticated. And I think it's clear that the ship is somehow a metaphor for the Union. And the question is, can it be brought together? Is the ship of state going to founder? But it's a lot more. It's not like a sort of one-to-one allegory like it was in Mardi. It's much more. So I think readings to sort of see these historical figures are illuminating and helpful. But it's like him trying to wrestle with the underlying political questions. What does it take to make a successful republic? And how is it vulnerable to demagoguery or to a tyrant or to these other weaknesses to which it might be prone? So I think that's part of why it has staying power beyond just the particular turmoils of the 50s. But students today still resonate with the political images.
Maybe one other point to throw in, as we are kind of circling around Melville as a commentator on his own time now. This book is about the whaling industry, right? And the whaling industry was the first international industry dominated by the United States. And the relatively few people who read the book in the 1850s were reading about something that makes most people really uncomfortable, which is they were reading about the ugly, bloody, violent, murderous procedures, right, by which the things that they take for granted in their lives are created and obtained. So, people were reading this book by lamps illuminated by whale oil. Ladies going out on the town to the opera were wearing hoop skirts, where it was whalebone that was keeping the hoop out there. Whale oil was a lubricant used in this early phase of the Industrial Revolution, and it illuminated the headlights of trains, right? So the products of the whaling industry were everywhere. People took them for granted. If you were a upper middle class, as we would say today, person, you expected to have these luxuries, parasols or umbrellas made out of ivory from a whale, but you didn't want to think very much about where they came from, who was sweating and bleeding and dying to get this stuff, and what was being done to nature in order to obtain them. So, as Bob said earlier, there's an environmentalist theme in this book. Doesn't take a big leap of the imagination to go from Moby Dick about the whale industry to where we are right now with the fossil fuel industry, and how we should be thinking about that, because none of us wants to give up our automobile. But maybe we also don't want to destroy the planet. So anyway, this book will never go away. I must apologize, however, because I need to go away at 3:30 to another meeting. So with appreciation to all of you, and I hope those of you who have been listening in have found this worthwhile. I certainly have. It's been great listening to Jeff and Bob. And I don't mean to stop things now, but I'm afraid I have to sign off. So thank you all very much. Thanks for the invitation, and stay healthy in these crazy times.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I was about to actually just ask everybody to have their final minute or so for the webinar. I think we've had the final minute from Professor Del Banco. If I may, Professor Bilbrow, could you give us a closing statement, and then Professor Wallace?
Well, I thought what Andrew said there a minute ago, that this book will continue to be read, and and I think this has come up several times, but different moments in readers, the history of us readers will draw forth particular themes, whether it be the ecological or the colonial or the racial. So I think that's part of why it's a great book, right? There's so much in here, and it's Melville's trying to weave these things together and help us see how they're connected. And so the process of following those threads and conversing with the book is part of our ongoing conversation about truth.
Thank you. And Professor Wallace.
So it is interesting to see which 19th century novelists are still doing as well as they did earlier. When I went to grad school, the book we studied was 8 American authors, and they were all male, they were all white. Dickinson didn't make it yet. And there's been quite a shift of the musical chairs between then and now. I think Dickinson is now maybe the great American poet, certainly as great as Whitman, maybe next to Shakespeare in British language. She is speaking to the 21st century in a way that she didn't speak to her own. And Melville has become that way. And maybe it's because his book was so capacious. It was so much of a chowder. It had so much into it that people couldn't digest it all at the time. But because of that, he's speaking to people in all sorts of human occupations and situations. So as the culture changes, we keep finding new ways to attach to the novel. So that is what makes it so interesting for me to teach, and why it was so interesting to try to kind of put together each decade of students responding to the book in a different way. And that's certainly been my experience, and it makes it a lot more fun to teach than a book that is pretty much locked in its own period.
Thank you so much. So thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you to our audience for coming to listen. So I'll just repeat for, in case somebody missed it at the beginning, if your questions didn't get answered, please send them by email to me, randall@nas.org, and I will forward them to our professors so they can have the option to answer. If you want to watch our fine program, it'll be available on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, and you should be getting email within 24 hours, with the link specifically to that, for eternity. I will advertise going forward. This is not our last webinar. We have, for the Great American Novel Series, I believe that our next one is going to be on the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's gotten some good shout outs during this webinar. And for our American History, American Character series, our next one should be the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's actually going to be next Tuesday, same time, same place. So we are going to be having more webinars. We trust they'll be able to live up to the standard provided by this one, and we're certainly doing our best. So again, thank you all so very much. It's been wonderful hearing. It's been a wonderful education for me.
Yes, thank you all. I'll close this out now. Thank you all for joining.